Hello and welcome to Antique Antics. Today we're going to take a look at the journey that prices for antiques have taken over the past 40 years. It's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, to be honest, and I'm sure a lot of you realise that some of your antiques are worth far less than they were in the 1980s. And we're going to try and make some sense of just why that might be and perhaps what the future may hold. So to look at this, really, we've got to go back in time until when I started in the trade in the late 1970s. So if we look at the average house full of furniture that we would clear at the auctioneers I worked at then in 1977 when I started. So 43 years ago. Now, the lifeblood of an auction room, it's sad to say, is the deceased estate. Whether it's clearing the house entirely or whether it comes via the family already having cleared it and inherited items and then bringing it along to auction room. And that remains the same today. But the houses we were clearing in the late 1970s and early 1980s were very, very different. We have to understand that the elderly folk that were passing away in the late 70s were 70s, 80s, that sort of age. So they were people that were born in 1900 or thereabouts. They lived through 2 world wars, and they lived through an age where antiques were worth nothing. And the Victorian seaside town that I lived in was home to a lot of great big Victorian houses. So we would clear a house in those days and we would go in and it was virtually untouched. There was still Victorian Edwardian furniture, ornaments, pictures, filling every nook and cranny. There wasn't a thought for these old folk to buy new items. You wouldn't find them going out and buying a new bedroom suite or a new 3-piece suite even, or new pictures to hang on the walls. It was the same things that their parents and often their grandparents had had. So if we were clearing a house of an elderly spinster, for argument's sake, and often it was elderly spinsters or sometimes pairs of elderly spinsters, sisters, we would find a house packed full of antiques. Now if we move on then, because little did we know that these sort of houses were going to become a thing of the past very, very quickly. So if we move on just a few years to the early to mid 80s, and we were finding that the average house we were clearing was pretty much what my parents' house would have been like. And I'm sure many of you that are watching, if they're my sort of age, around about the mid to late 50s, early 60s, I'm sure you know what I mean by that. Our parents had no preconceptions about filling the houses full of antiques and collectibles. In fact, many times they didn't. Many families of that nature didn't even collect anything as we know it today. So that was the average house perhaps that we were clearing by the mid 80s. Very, very different. There was nothing of value in these houses. As I say, they didn't collect. And then what happened? The Antiques Roadshow on TV got bigger and bigger and bigger. Started in the 70s, of course, and it was a popular programme, but it wasn't the big thing that it became. But by the mid 80s, it had become one of the most popular programmes on TV. So it piqued people's interest in antiques. And so we entered a period in the late 80s, I would say, where antiques, broadly speaking, and particularly art, reached a peak. And some of the prices made during those periods have yet to be bettered today, over 30 years later. So there was the late 80s, with the Antiques Roadshow in full flow and the British public taken in completely by this new antiques thing. So people did start thinking about maybe I should collect something. They may not have been talking about collecting things worth thousands, even hundreds of pounds, but maybe they wanted to collect by then. So this fueled this period where antiques and auctions in general were having success that they hadn't had before. What comes next? The 1990s, the decade that I always like to think of as the decade of the collector. Now, if I just explain briefly what I mean by that, you will all know exactly where I'm coming from. You couldn't open a Sunday colour supplement without finding a page where there were companies dishing out instant collectibles. It may well have been a terrible tacky reproduction of a samurai sword. It may well have been a monthly purchase of a collector's plate, and they'd be telling you they were wonderful investments and they were limited edition. And so the 90s became the age of the collectible. We weren't to know at that time, well, perhaps we were as auctioneers, but the public weren't to know that all of these instant collectibles were anything but a good investment, because a collectible has to evolve to become a collectible piece. You can't have an instant collectible, or not very often. So this started happening. People started collecting. It may well have been what I've said about the Sunday colour supplements. It may well have been things as simple as thimbles or souvenir spoons or little cottages like Lilliput Lane or Royal Dalton figures. But everybody was collecting. Before you know it, our houses were full of collectibles, or should I say collectibles. So what happened then? We get to the end of the 90s and the TV companies really picked up on this. I think the first one to come along after the 30-year or 20-year period of success for the Antiques Roadshow. The next one to come along, I think, was probably Bargain Hunt, and it was followed by Flog It, Treasure Hunt, Antiques Road Trip, etc., etc. Suddenly, daytime TV was full of them. It was the new cooking programmes, if you like. So the world went wild, or the British went wild about collectibles, and it wasn't expensive collectibles, as I've touched on. It was things that people might want to go out and spend 20 or 30 pounds of their well-earned cash. Once a month they'd go off to the antiques fair and come back with a new Silvac figure maybe, or a new Beswick figure, or something of this nature, not something worth an awful lot of money, things that were 20, 30, 40 pounds. Maybe if you push the boat out, you might spend 50 or 60 pounds. But it was affordable collectibles. And then what happened? We move out of the 90s, we move into the noughties. What happened? Effectively, it all came crashing down. And what was to blame? I tell you what, blame the Swedes. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, I mean the huge success of Ikea. Ikea came along with their clean lines and minimalism, and suddenly people thought, do you know what? I don't want stripped pine and vases of dried flowers and ornaments filling the shelves. I like the look of this minimalism. This looks great. So suddenly, literally over the course of about 3 or 4 years, the British nation ditched their collectibles, and we in an auction room were getting boxfuls of them brought in then, saying, oh, I used to collect this, I don't want it anymore. So the value plummeted. And I don't mean the value of fine antiques, which of course the value of a lot of those sort of things did go down, but things that were worth 40 or 50 pounds 5 years earlier were suddenly worth a fiver. So we went from becoming a nation of collectors to a nation of minimalists in a very short period of time. Now, the minimalism thing, of course, this lent itself to modern design. The look of Ikea is based on modern design. You look at a lot of the upholstery patterns that were coming out, curtain patterns that were coming out, were rehashes of the 50s and 60s. So suddenly, that's what people started collecting. It was a nostalgia-driven thing. It was things they could remember as children. It wasn't dusty old musty antiques. It wasn't grandfather clocks and old dark oil paintings. It was bright, clean, modern design that went well with the Ikea look, this minimalist look. Housewives and house husbands didn't want shelves full of ornaments where they had to move them all to dust the shelves. They wanted emptiness And what fitted that was this modern design and mid-century. And this has been the case now for the past 10 years or so. That's been the up-and-coming collector's market amongst the young. And by the young, I don't just mean 20-year-olds, I mean 30, 40, even 50-year-olds. I call myself young. I like modern design these days. So it was a new thing that came along that fitted perfectly in with the Ikea look. And so where are we today? Here we are in 2020, and the modern design look is still extremely strong. Very, very strong indeed. I would say, without a doubt, it's the market that most new collectors move into is modern design. You have to be a little careful what you're buying it because sometimes it is a little overpriced, but we've talked about that before. So where does that leave us with these genuine antiques? These antiques that in 1977 we were going into houses and finding them full of them. Well, there's still a market. And in fact, I have to tell you all that that market is reviving. It's been a slow process, but I've seen over the past year or so that prices in auction for these traditional antiques seems to be rising. And it seems to be heading back to those days of the late 80s through to the late 90s. And let's hope so, because what we really need to do, we need to get young people interested in antique items to give it the kick up the backside it deserves. You know, there's plenty of room in this world for antiques and modern design. So let's look at both. Go along to your local auction room. There's still some affordable pieces there. Buy some Victorian mahogany. Buy a Georgian barometer. Buy a long case clock. They're affordable. And I'll tell you something, you get one antique piece of furniture and you put it in a house full of Ikea and modern design, it sticks out beautifully. It makes it shine. So go along and buy an antique. It'll fit in well with your house full of modern design. Until the next time, bye-bye.